The night was unusually still in Kansas City, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath. The faint hum of a distant car engine and the occasional flicker of a faulty streetlight were the only sounds to break the silence. On a worn bus stop bench sat Darren, a man whose presence seemed to blend into the shadows. His posture was slouched, his shoulders weighed down by exhaustion, yet his demeanor carried an unmistakable composure. He looked like any other overworked individual trying to make it through another grueling day. Darren's skin, dark and glistening under the streetlight's intermittent glow, bore the evidence of years spent under the sun. His face was lined with the kind of fatigue that didn't come from one bad day, but from a lifetime of pushing through challenges. Tonight, he carried a heavy backpack filled with tools from his job as a mechanic, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies clung to his work shirt from his second shift scrubbing offices. It was past midnight, and all he wanted was to be home, sitting in his old recliner, catching a few precious hours of sleep before another day began. The streets were nearly deserted, save for a group of young men lingering a few feet away. They were loud, their laughter sharp against the silence, their oversized hoodies and cocky postures making it clear they felt at home in the dimly lit street. Darren noticed them but didn't react, his gaze fixed ahead on the empty road. Years of military training had taught him the art of discipline, how to keep calm in situations that could quickly spiral out of control. One of the young men, his voice dripping with mockery, called out, "Yo, old man." Darren didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look their way. He gripped his bag a little tighter and kept his focus on the horizon. But his silence only seemed to provoke them. "What's up, you deaf?" Another voice chimed in, the words laced with cruelty. Darren's heart beat steadily in his chest, but inside, he was calculating. He'd been here before, not in this exact place, but in moments like these, where someone mistook his quiet demeanor for weakness. He understood the dynamics of this kind of confrontation. He could tell from their body language and tone that they were looking for a target, someone to test their bravado on. They didn't know who they were dealing with, and Darren wasn't eager to show them. The tension in the air thickened as one of the men threw a crumpled soda can, the aluminum skidding across the pavement to rest near Darren's boots. Still, he didn't react, but his grip on the backpack strap tightened. The memories of his time as a Marine came flooding back, the discipline, the training, the countless hours spent homing skills that had saved lives and taken them. Those experiences had shaped him into the man he was now, a man who understood the value of restraint. But restraint had its limits. One of the men, emboldened by Darren's silence, stepped closer. His sneakers scraped against the concrete as he leaned forward. "What, you too good to talk to us?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mock bravado. Darren glanced up for the first time, his eyes locking onto the young man's. They were calm, steady, and unshaken, a stark contrast to the erratic energy of the group. "I'm just waiting for my bus," he said simply, his voice low and even. The young man smirked, turning back to his friends. "Hear that? He's too busy for us," he mocked, his tone meant to entertain the others. They laughed, their voices echoing off the empty buildings, but there was a faint edge of uncertainty in their laughter. Darren's calmness was unsettling, like the stillness before a storm. The leader of the group, a wiry young man with a baseball cap turned backward, decided to push further. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, his voice louder now. "Man, look at you, sitting there like you own the place. Bet you don't even belong around here," he said, leaning in as if to intimidate Darren. Still, Darren didn't move. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, the only sign that he even heard the words. But inside, he was measuring every detail, the number of aggressors, their positioning, their level of threat. Years of experience had taught him that most people in situations like this were all bark and no bite. But he also knew that it only took one bad decision to turn a situation dangerous. Another young man, emboldened by his friend's antics, tossed a fast food wrapper that landed just inches from Darren's boots. "Come on, old man. You scared or something?" he jeered, his voice rising in pitch. Darren's face remained calm, but his body was on high alert. He didn't want this to escalate, but he was ready if it did. His gaze shifted to the faint headlights of an approaching bus in the distance, a small sign of relief on the horizon. But the group wasn't done yet. The man in the baseball cap stepped into Darren's space, close enough to shove his shoulder. It wasn't hard, more of a test than an attack, but it crossed a line Darren couldn't ignore. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, and looked the young man in the eye. "You don't want to do this," Darren said quietly, his voice calm but firm. The laughter from the group faltered, replaced by a tension that hung thick in the air. Darren's size and the quiet authority in his tone gave them pause, but pride and bravado are powerful motivators, and the leader wasn't ready to back down. "Who do you think you are? Some kind of tough guy?" Baseball Cap scoffed, stepping closer. His friends jeered behind him, their voices urging him on. Darren didn't respond, but the air around him seemed to shift. There was no anger in his eyes, only a calm that was more intimidating than any outburst could have been. The young man swung suddenly, a wild, untrained punch aimed at Darren's face. But Darren moved like a shadow, sidestepping effortlessly and gripping the young man's wrist in one smooth motion. "Stop," Darren said, his voice low and commanding. The group hesitated, their confidence wavering as they realized they had underestimated the man they had chosen to antagonize. But Darren knew it wasn't over yet. The young man froze, his wrist locked in Darren's iron grip. For a moment, it felt like the entire street held its breath. Darren's eyes bore into him, calm but unyielding, as if silently daring him to make another move. The leader's friends, who moments ago had been egging him on, now stood a few steps back, their cocky smirks replaced with uncertainty. Darren released the young man's wrist, stepping back just enough to create space between them. "Walk away," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the words land hard. The leader staggered back, rubbing his wrist and glaring at Darren, but there was hesitation in his movements now. His bravado had taken a hit, and the others could feel it too. But pride was a stubborn thing. Instead of retreating, the leader turned to his friends, forcing a laugh. "Man, he's just lucky I wasn't serious," he said, his voice louder than it needed to be, trying to regain the upper hand. "Let's see how tough he really is." He lunged again, this time shoving Darren with both hands, hard enough to make him take a step back. Darren inhaled deeply, his patience wearing thin. He could feel the adrenaline building in his veins, the muscle memory of his training urging him to act. But he didn't want to escalate things. "Not here, not like this. This isn't the fight you want," he said, his tone firm but measured. "Trust me." The young men exchanged glances, their earlier confidence shaken but not entirely gone. They didn't know who Darren was, didn't know the life he had lived or the battles he had fought. To them, he was just another tired man sitting at a bus stop, someone they thought they could intimidate without consequences. But Darren's calmness was starting to unsettle them, making them second-guess their assumptions. One of the others, a shorter man with a buzz cut, stepped forward, trying to salvage their pride. "You think you're tough, huh? Bet you've never been in a real fight," he said, his voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts to sound confident. Darren didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said everything they didn't want to hear, that they were in over their heads. But they weren't ready to back down yet. Not when they felt the eyes of their friends on them, not when their egos were on the line. Behind Darren's calm exterior, memories flickered like an old film reel. He thought back to his time in the Marines, to the nights spent on watch in hostile territories where the smallest sound could mean the difference between life and death. He thought about the brothers he had lost, the battles that had left scars both visible and hidden. And he thought about the promise he had made to himself when he returned home, to live with purpose, to fight only when necessary, and to protect what truly mattered. But this moment wasn't about the past. It was about here and now, about teaching these young men a lesson without letting things spiral out of control. Darren shifted his stance slightly, his posture relaxed but ready, his body language sending a clear message. He wasn't afraid. The bus headlights appeared again in the distance, a faint glow cutting through the darkness. Darren felt a small surge of relief. If he could just hold his ground a little longer, the arrival of the bus might diffuse the situation. But the group wasn't ready to let it go. They were still caught up in their need to prove something, still too blinded by their own bravado to recognize the warning signs. The leader stepped forward again, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. "You're not as tough as you think," he spat, his voice filled with frustration. Darren tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And you're not as smart as you think," he replied, his voice calm but cutting. The words hit harder than any punch, and the leader's face twisted with anger. He took another step forward, raising his fist, but Darren moved first. It wasn't an attack, it was a statement. Darren's hand shot up, catching the young man's wrist mid-swing and holding it there effortlessly. The leader struggled, but Darren's grip didn't budge. "Enough," Darren said, his voice low but commanding. The single word cut through the tension like a knife, and for a moment, no one moved. Darren released the leader's wrist, stepping back once more. "This is your last chance to walk away," he added, his tone leaving no room for argument. The other young men shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence all but gone. One of them muttered, "Maybe we should go," his voice barely audible. But the leader wasn't ready to back down, not yet. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound tough. Darren didn't respond. He just stood there, calm and unshaken, his presence alone enough to fill the air with tension. The bus finally pulled up, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop. The driver opened the doors, glancing warily at the scene unfolding in front of him. Darren took a step toward the bus, his back to the group, signaling that he was done with the confrontation. But as he moved, he heard the scuff of sneakers on pavement behind him. One of the young men had taken a step forward, his fists clenched, his pride still urging him to make a move. Darren turned back, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Think carefully about your next move," Darren said, his voice steady. "Because I promise you, it won't end the way you think it will." The young man froze, his confidence crumbling under Darren's gaze. The others stayed back, their earlier bravado now replaced with nervous glances at each other. Slowly, one by one, they began to back away, their pride bruised but their bodies unharmed. The leader lingered for a moment longer, his jaw tight and his fists still clenched, but even he couldn't ignore the quiet power in Darren's presence. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and turned away, motioning for his friends to follow. Darren watched them disappear into the shadows, his expression unreadable. The tension in his body began to ease, but the weight of the moment lingered. He turned back to the bus, stepping on board and nodding to the driver. As the bus pulled away, Darren sank into a seat near the back, his backpack resting on the floor at his feet. He stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of yellow and white. His mind replayed the encounter, not with anger or regret, but with quiet reflection. He thought about those young men, about the choices they had made and the paths they were on. He wondered if they would think back on this night, if they would learn anything from it. Darren didn't have the answers, but he hoped that somewhere in their minds, a seed had been planted, a seed of respect, of understanding, of restraint. The bus rumbled on through the quiet streets, and Darren leaned back in his seat, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't proud of what had happened, but he wasn't ashamed either. He had done what he needed to do, no more, no less. The city lights continued to pass by, casting fleeting shadows across Darren's face. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the bus engine soothe his mind. But even as the night moved on, the lesson of the encounter lingered, a reminder that strength isn't just about power. It's about knowing when to stand firm and when to walk away. As the bus meandered through the dimly lit streets, Darren found himself replaying the events at the stop in his mind. There was a heaviness in his chest, not from fear or regret, but from the echoes of a familiar frustration. He'd seen this before, young men chasing respect in all the wrong ways, mistaking bravado for strength. It gnawed at him because he knew where that path could lead, how quickly those choices could spiral into something far worse. The rhythmic hum of the bus wasn't enough to drown out his thoughts. Darren glanced around at the other passengers, their faces tired, their postures slouched. A young woman cradled a sleeping child, her head resting against the window. An older man clutched a briefcase, his gaze distant, as if lost in the same kind of thoughts that weighed on Darren. Outside, the city seemed alive in its own way. Neon signs flickered above late-night diners, and the occasional sound of laughter spilled out from bars and corner shops. It was a city that never truly slept, but tonight, Darren felt more disconnected from it than ever. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a small notebook. Its worn edges and dog-eared pages spoke of years of use. Flipping through it, he landed on a page filled with scribbled notes and names. Names of people he had served with, friends he had lost, lives that had intersected with his in ways that had changed him forever. He tapped his pen lightly against the page, his mind wandering back to a conversation he'd had with one of his closest friends in the Marines, a man named Marcus. Marcus had always been the optimist, the one who believed in second chances and the potential for change. People are like rivers, Marcus had once said. They might start out rough, full of rapids and twists, but if they're guided right, they can smooth out, find their way. Darren had never been as hopeful as Marcus, but tonight, those words echoed in his mind. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of his phone vibrating in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a name flash across the screen, Carolyn. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Carolyn was his neighbor, a kind-hearted woman in her 60s who had taken it upon herself to check in on Darren ever since he moved into the apartment next door. She wasn't one to call without a reason, though, and that made him curious. "Hey, Carolyn," Darren said, answering the call. "Darren, are you home yet?" Her voice was tinged with concern, a tone he had come to recognize well. "Not yet. Just on the bus. What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, and Darren could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. "I saw some boys hanging around near the building earlier," she said finally. "They didn't look like they belonged. I thought you should know." Darren's grip on the phone tightened slightly. He didn't need her to describe them. He already had a pretty good idea of who they were. "Thanks for letting me know," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be home soon." As he hung up, a sense of unease settled over him. He wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't something he let himself feel easily, but he was cautious. If those young men had followed him, it meant they weren't just angry. They were determined, and that made them unpredictable. When the bus finally pulled up to his stop, Darren stepped off and surveyed his surroundings. The street was quiet, the faint hum of streetlights the only sound. His apartment building stood a block away, its familiar outline offering a small sense of comfort. But as he walked, he stayed alert, his senses tuned to every shadow and movement. Reaching the building, Darren scanned the area. There was no immediate sign of anyone, but the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. He stepped inside, the door closing with a soft thud behind him. The lobby was dimly lit, and the old elevator groaned as it carried him up to his floor. As he unlocked the door to his apartment, Darren paused, listening. The hallway was silent, but the weight of Carolyn's warning lingered. Once inside, he locked the door behind him and placed his backpack on the kitchen counter. He didn't bother turning on the lights. Darkness didn't bother him. In fact, it felt more familiar, more natural. Sitting down on the couch, he let out a long breath. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't rest. He thought about the young men again, wondering what had driven them to act the way they did. Was it peer pressure, anger, desperation? He didn't know, but part of him wanted to find out, not for their sake, but for his own. As the night stretched on, Darren's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. Opening it, he saw an unfamiliar number, but the words sent a chill down his spine. Asterisk, asterisk. You think you're untouchable? You'll see. Asterisk, asterisk. Darren stared at the message for a moment before placing the phone face down on the table. He wasn't sure how they had gotten his number. But that wasn't what mattered now. What mattered was figuring out what their next move might be, and preparing for it. He stood, walking over to the window and pulling the curtain back just enough to see outside. The street was empty, but that didn't mean much. He thought back to Marcus's words again, about rivers and second chances. Darren wanted to believe that these young men could change, that they could find a better path. But he also knew that not everyone wanted to change. Some people were content to stay in the rapids, to fight against the current until it consumed them. Darren turned away from the window, his jaw tightening. He had spent years fighting battles overseas, but this felt different. This wasn't about survival or strategy. This was about understanding, about finding a way to defuse a situation before it spiraled out of control. And yet, as much as he wanted to avoid another confrontation, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the next encounter came. The question wasn't asterisk if asterisk it would happen. It was asterisk when asterisk. And when it did, Darren knew he had to be ready. Darren paced the length of his apartment, the weight of the message still heavy in his mind. The room was silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards under his boots. He had faced worse threats before, ones that came from people far more dangerous than a group of young men trying to prove themselves. But there was something about this, something reckless and unpredictable, that made it harder to ignore. He sat down at the edge of his bed and reached for his phone again, reading the text one more time. The words weren't particularly threatening on their own, but Darren knew how easily things could escalate. These young men didn't just want to intimidate him. They wanted to regain the power they felt they'd lost at the bus stop. And that kind of desperation could be dangerous. Pulling open the drawer of his nightstand, Darren's fingers brushed against the smooth metal of an old Marine Corps coin. He held it in his palm, the familiar weight grounding him for a moment. It was a reminder of who he was, of what he had endured. He thought of the lessons he'd learned during his time in the service, lessons about staying calm under pressure and choosing battles wisely. Those lessons had saved his life more times than he could count. The apartment felt too small, too quiet. Darren decided he needed air, even if it was just a walk to clear his head. He grabbed his jacket, slipped it on, and stepped outside. The cool night air hit him immediately, sharpening his senses. He scanned the street as he walked, his eyes sweeping over parked cars and darkened alleyways. Kansas City had its share of rough nights, but tonight felt different. It wasn't the city's usual hum of life that made him uneasy, it was the silence. He rounded the corner toward a small convenience store, the fluorescent lights inside casting a harsh glow onto the sidewalk. The familiar ding of the doorbell greeted him as he stepped inside. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, gave Darren a polite nod before returning to his newspaper. Darren grabbed a bottle of water and made his way to the counter, his eyes instinctively scanning the reflection in the glass behind the clerk. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement outside. A figure lingered across the street, partially obscured by the shadows. Darren's grip on the water bottle tightened as he paid for his purchase. He didn't let his nerves show, didn't glance back outside. Instead, he took his change, nodded at the clerk, and walked back out into the night. The figure was gone. Darren's jaw tightened as he crossed the street, his senses on high alert. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind him, stopping when he paused and starting again when he resumed walking. It wasn't hard to guess who it might be. Turning the corner onto a quieter street, Darren stopped abruptly, waiting. The footsteps hesitated before a voice spoke from behind him. "You thought you could just embarrass us and walk away." Darren turned slowly, his face calm despite the tension in the air. The young man with the baseball cap stepped out of the shadows, his posture stiff, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. A few steps behind him, the other three hovered, their expressions a mix of hesitation and bravado. "I gave you a chance to walk away," Darren said evenly, his voice steady but firm, "and I'd suggest you take it now." Baseball cap laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "You don't get it, do you? You don't get to make us look weak and just go on with your life like nothing happened." The young man's words were filled with more than just anger. They carried resentment, a bitterness that spoke of deeper wounds. Darren's gaze didn't waver, but he could see it now. This wasn't just about what had happened at the bus stop. These boys were carrying something heavier, something they didn't know how to let go of. "You're angry," Darren said, his tone calm but pointed. "But this isn't the way to fix it." Baseball cap took a step closer, his friends following hesitantly. "You think you're better than us?" he snapped. "With your quiet act and your tough guy moves? You don't know anything about us." Darren's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained measured. I don't have to know you to see where this is headed. You got nothing to prove to me, and you sure as hell don't want to prove it this way. The tension crackled in the air like static electricity. Darren could feel the weight of the moment, the fine line between escalation and resolution. Baseball Cap's hands twitched at his sides, and Darren's instincts screamed at him to stay ready. He didn't want this to end in violence, but he also wasn't naive enough to believe words alone would be enough. The young men closed in, their movements uncertain but purposeful. Darren stayed rooted, his posture calm but ready. He knew they were testing him again, pushing to see how far he'd go, and as much as he wanted to de-escalate, Darren understood that this time it might not be up to him. Darren stood firm, his gaze steady as the group closed the gap between them. The streetlights overhead flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across their faces. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Darren's mind raced, assessing every movement, every glance, every twitch in their postures. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was prepared for one. "Step back," Darren said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't bluffing. The young men exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly, but it wasn't enough to deter them. Baseball Cap smirked, the same defiance from before flickering in his eyes, but Darren noticed something else now, hesitation, a crack in the bravado. "Why don't you make us?" Baseball Cap shot back, taking another step closer. His voice carried a forced confidence, the kind that came from someone too far in to back out. The others shuffled nervously behind him, emboldened by his words but visibly unsure. Darren let out a slow breath, his patience thinning. "This isn't about me, and it's not about proving anything to your friends," he said. "You're about to cross a line you can't come back from. Is that what you really want?" For a moment, the words seemed to land, Baseball Cap's expression faltering just slightly. But before anyone could speak, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the end of the street. All heads turned toward the noise, and Darren's stomach tightened. A man emerged from the shadows, his presence instantly shifting the dynamic. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark jacket. His gait was deliberate, his eyes sharp as they swept over the group. The young men stiffened, their postures shifting as if instinctively recognizing the newcomer as a threat. Darren didn't know the man, but something about him set off alarm bells. His movements were too controlled, too purposeful. This wasn't someone who had just stumbled onto the scene. He was here for a reason. "You boys causing trouble again," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. His gaze settled on Baseball Cap, who visibly tensed. "And no, we're just talking," Baseball Cap stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. The others shrank back slightly, their bravado replaced with unease. Darren watched the interaction carefully, his instincts on high alert. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here to help. Darren's grip on his surroundings tightened as he tried to piece together what was happening. The man turned his attention to Darren, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're the guy from the bus stop, aren't you?" he asked, his tone flat but laced with something unsettling. Darren didn't respond immediately, his mind racing. This man wasn't part of the original group, but he clearly knew enough about what had happened. "And who are you supposed to be?" Darren finally asked, keeping his tone neutral. The man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Let's just say I've got a vested interest in making sure these boys don't end up in trouble they can't handle," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the group. "You seem to make quite an impression on them." Darren didn't trust him, not for a second. The man's words were calculated, his presence deliberate. He wasn't here to defuse the situation, he was here to control it. "I don't want any trouble," Darren said, his voice firm but measured. "I was just trying to go about my night. They're the ones who decided to follow me." The man tilted his head slightly, studying Darren. "That's so," he said, his tone skeptical. He turned back to Baseball Cap and the others. "That true, boys?" Baseball Cap hesitated, his eyes darting between Darren and the man. "We just wanted to talk to him," he said finally, his voice losing all its earlier edge. The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You got a funny way of talking," he said. "And you," he pointed at Darren, "you seem to have a knack for finding yourself in the middle of things. Almost like you're looking for trouble. Darren's jaw tightened. I'm not the one following people down dark streets, he said evenly. The man's smirk widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Fair enough, he said. But here's the thing, you've made an impression on these boys, and now it's my job to make sure that impression doesn't turn into something permanent. You understand? Darren's stomach sank as the man's words clicked into place. This wasn't about the bus stop anymore. This was something bigger, something deeper. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here by coincidence. The group stood frozen, their earlier bravado completely stripped away. Darren could feel the tension mounting, the situation teetering on the edge of something dangerous. I understand one thing, Darren said slowly, his voice steady. I'm not here to make trouble, and I'm not here to back down. So whatever you're trying to do, let's cut to the chase. The man's smirk faded slightly, replaced with a look of cold calculation. You're a bold one, he said. I'll give you that, but boldness has a way of turning into recklessness if you're not careful. Darren didn't flinch, his gaze locked on the man. The street seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier with every passing second. The group of young men stood frozen, their earlier confidence now replaced with fear. The man took a step closer, his presence looming. Darren held his ground, his muscles tensed, his mind racing through the possibilities. Whatever was about to happen, Darren knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over yet, and the stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. The silence between them felt endless, stretching the tension so tight that it seemed the slightest movement could snap it. Darren's heart pounded, but his breathing remained controlled, just as he had trained it to be in moments like this. The man stepped closer, his gaze unwavering, but Darren didn't budge. Behind him, the group of young men shuffled uneasily, their earlier confidence reduced to nervous energy. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. You got guts, I'll give you that, the man said, his tone calm but laced with something unsettling. But I've seen men like you before, too proud for their own good, always thinking they can handle more than they really can. Darren tilted his head slightly, his voice cool and steady. Maybe you've seen men like me, but you don't know me. And if you think I'm just going to stand here and let you intimidate me, you've got another thing coming. The man's smirk faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly, stepping even closer until they were almost face to face. Darren could see the flicker of frustration behind the man's eyes, a sign that his carefully constructed facade was cracking. Then, from the corner of his eye, Darren noticed movement. One of the young men, clearly unnerved, began to edge away, as if trying to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. Darren clocked it immediately, his instincts sharpening. The group's unity was breaking down, and with it, the power dynamic was shifting. The man noticed it too. Where do you think you're going? He snapped, turning his attention toward the boy. The young man froze, his fear evident. You think you can just walk away now? You're in this, all of you. The distraction was all Darren needed. With the man's focus momentarily diverted, Darren stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His voice cut through the air like a knife. Enough. You're trying to control them with fear, but that's not going to work anymore. The man turned back to Darren, his expression darkening. And what are you going to do about it? Darren didn't answer with words. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, his posture calm but exuding an unmistakable authority. It was the kind of presence that came from years of discipline, training, and experience, the kind of presence that couldn't be faked. The man hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. Darren could see the doubt creeping in, the realization that this wasn't a fight he could win with intimidation alone. You don't want to do this, Darren said, his voice steady but firm. Walk away while you still can. For a moment, it seemed like the man might listen. His eyes darted between Darren and the group of young men, as if weighing his options. But then, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of desperation, of a man who had backed himself into a corner and didn't know how to get out. Without warning, the man lunged forward, his movements quick and aggressive. But Darren was faster. Years of training and instinct kicked in, and he sidestepped the attack with practiced ease. In one fluid motion, Darren deflected the man's arm, using his own momentum against him. The man stumbled, caught off guard, and Darren seized the opportunity to take control. The entire confrontation lasted only seconds, but to those watching, it felt like an eternity. When it was over, the man found himself on the ground, Darren standing over him with an air of calm authority. "Enough," Darren said again, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This ends here." The man glared up at him, his pride clearly bruised, but he didn't make another move. Darren stepped back, giving him the space to get up, but his message was clear. There would be no second chances. The group of young men stood frozen, their eyes wide as they took in what had just happened. Baseball Cap, who had been the most vocal earlier, looked down at the ground, his bravado completely gone. "You all have a choice to make," Darren said, addressing them directly. "You can keep following people like him, letting fear and anger dictate your actions, or you can decide to be better, to rise above it. But that choice starts now." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The young men exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Darren's message sinking in. Slowly, one by one, they began to back away, their earlier hostility replaced with something else. Maybe regret, maybe shame, or maybe the faint stirrings of change. The man on the ground watched them retreat, his expression dark and unreadable. But when he looked back at Darren, there was no mistaking the anger in his eyes. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. Darren met his gaze, unflinching. "It is for tonight," he said simply. The man pushed himself to his feet, brushing off his jacket. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Darren alone under the flickering streetlights. As the quiet of the night returned, Darren let out a slow breath, the tension finally beginning to drain from his body. He glanced around, ensuring the area was clear, before continuing on his way. But as he walked, his mind lingered on the man's parting words. Something told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And while the immediate danger had passed, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the night were only the beginning of something far more complex.